3. Hello, this is Dan O'Brien from Kansas State University, along with Frayne, Olson, and David Riplinger from North Dakota State University. And we'd like to continue our series of discussions on bioenergy issues, current issues affecting policy and trade directions, as well as the current profitability of some sectors of that industry. I'd like to start out, and with me today, Frayne Olson, David Riplinger from NDSU, as had been mentioned. So anyway, start out with the current state of the ethanol industry in terms of profitability. It looks like after several months, basically since November of 24, of moderate losses, anywhere from 1 to 11 or 12 cents, 11 or 12 cents, especially November, December of last year, less so since then, that so far during the month of May 2025, that we've seen a little bit of a return, at least to break even or profitability, at least by my numbers, showing a break even ethanol price of $1.61 per gallon and about 3 cents a gallon profit. And really I think most of that change has come from the ethanol price itself moving up about 3 cents from April into May. The corn price has actually dropped some, so that helps on profitability. About the same in terms of DDG prices. Oil prices up a little bit. So what's interesting is when you look at the actual production that you're seeing, if anything, actually kind of a decline in ethanol production, not falling off a cliff, but during a time of high when you'd anticipate fuel demand being higher, et cetera, we're looking at a somewhat of a sideways to moderating, I guess I'd call it a moderating trend in terms of production and stocks. So, that although that's surprising, it sure bodes better for the next coming months than if we saw overburdening stocks building up and anticipated that prices would start to fall. So anyway, with that background, we decided we'd like to talk about some policy issues that are occurring right now and on the horizon, and then finish up with some discussion of trade issues as affects agriculture overall and in particular bioenergy. On the policy side, Dave, I'd like to turn it over to you. You had mentioned that in some of the recent legislative bills being passed. I'll let you name them, et cetera, that is being talked about in the press, but that 45Z policy implications for bioenergy are at play. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is obviously recorded at a certain time, and hopefully this is timely when the viewers get a chance to listen to it. But it's Friday the 23rd. Just recently, the House passed the budget reconciliation for 26, and included a lot of things, including the extension of the 45Z tax credit. And 45Z shows a lot of promise for biofuels, a lot of opportunity for agriculture as a whole, providing, a home for corn, soybean, canola, you name it. It's an important piece. The 45Z itself, again, part of the tax code, uh, production tax credits, depending on the carbon intensity of the fuel, as well as a little multiplier if you're producing sustainable aviation fuel. So again, that incentive to get that new fuel to commercial scale in the United States. To me, I think it's very interesting because it does communicate support, obviously, with those members, because it did pass. And this is maybe somewhat in contrast of what the administration is doing, again, because 45Z has been kind of quiet for a few months. And so the question is, does this turn up the heat a little bit on the pot? Are things going to get going? And if it does, it'd be very positive for agriculture. It's also interesting too. One of the key pieces for 45Z is the extension of considering on-farm practices for that carbon intensity. And again, the long-term expectation is that we would have incentives for farmers to document current practices or to adopt and document new practices, and could be really, really impactful. But again, that's kind of been put on hold for a few months, and we'll see if this is the start of a rekindling of the fire, or if it's just the availability of the funding. And again, it's important too. 45Z did end up replacing the old biodiesel tax credit. And
Mhm.
so, having it extended is good news, even though it's not set at the level that the biodiesel tax credit had, but it does give that somewhat longer horizon for knowing that funding, will be there.
Interesting. In the last week or so, rumors affecting the market on supposed leaks on what some of the details are of this. Some folks, some quarters, indicating that the news would be disappointing for the bioenergy industry, and others not so much. Some discussion, again, unsubstantiated, probably, with regard to how small refiners are affected by some of these rules, et cetera. So, uh, yeah, I guess anytime you're dealing with a secretive policy discussion with major legislation in the United States coming through Congress affecting the bioenergy industry, that you'd have this type of uncertainty. I would say you and I were talking before we came on the air about how, if you look at for instance, at the Renewable Fuels Association, at their listing of ethanol, well, bioenergy plants, ethanol plants in particular, now they've included for the first time an alcohol to jet SAF production capacity by refinery. And they're not showing any existing capacity, but they're identifying about 7 or 8 refineries that are targeted to be built. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of groundwork done over the past few years by companies to develop SAF projects. And a few, Gevo, especially in our neck of the woods, South Dakota, and they purchased an ethanol refinery here in North Dakota. They've put in a lot of work. They do have a signed loan agreement with DOE, which is still in effect. There's also Lonzatech, which has a facility in Soperton, Georgia. They're kind of a unique thing because they were going to import somewhat lower carbon Brazilian sugarcane ethanol. Well, with tariffs and things, that gets a little bit more interesting. The full build out of SAF, going from drawing board blueprint to commercial scale operation of one or multiple refineries takes a lot of work and takes a lot of assurance in terms of market, in terms of tax credits. This does, the House's vote does kind of add some support for 45Z being there. That alone might not get things going aggressively, but it's a piece of good news. Um, It'll be interesting too because you also have, we of course have the alcohol to jet, which is very much of interest to ethanol and the corn industry. And then of course we can flip back to fat oil or grease to SAF, similar to renewable diesel. And that too is a really big future market. I won't even say potential market, it's a future market. Just how fast do we get there and what's the path? But this is a piece of good news as we're kind of in those early stages of moving towards, large scale commercial production.
And yeah, and part of those discussions had to do with whether imported used vegetable oils would be able to be imported in the country or not. Well, wow, if a person's been paying attention in the last several months as to what's happened to these bioenergy related vegetable oil markets, my goodness, that was a big deal. A lot of crowding out occurring, at least as I understand it.
Yeah, no,
So
absolutely. Yeah, if I can jump in. Yeah, so I mean, I know a few folks who operate, either in the Gulf or on the West Coast. You were looking for that used cooking oil because it had such a small carbon footprint, fit very well. You had scale, and with the trade disputes, that becomes a little bit more questionable, and that's pretty tough because some of those were pretty well positioned for intermediate long-term success, and this is the trade dispute that kind of threw a stick into things.
speaking of trade disputes, Frayne, uh, do you have any thoughts or comments on what you've been observing in terms of U.S. trade discussions? Particularly, sounds like that between the U.S. and the European Union.
Yeah, and again, this is, we're doing this on May 23rd, and this morning, there's an announcement from the White House saying that they're on June 1 that there's going to be a 50% import tariff on products coming from the European Union. And then there was also an additional 25% on iPhones, but we won't talk about that today. The European issue is one that we need to pay attention to. We do some agricultural trade with the European Union. Right as of last year, Spain and Germany were our number 5 and number 6 largest soybean importers. So they do import some soybeans primarily for crush domestically within the European community. Um, and yet the real issue then for agriculture specifically in the US will be, will the Europeans retaliate? And if so, will agricultural products be included in that? So just because the United States put tariff on the products coming into the US doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be retaliation or that that retaliation will include US agricultural products. So again, some things to think about, some things to look at. There's a lot of I guess, speculation right now on what's the underlying motivation for, the tariffs and the trade agreements and all the discussions going on. And that's I guess I'll share my opinion and my viewpoint. Just understand it's my opinion. I do think a lot of this is driven by the desire to have bilateral trade agreements, and that negotiating bilateral agreements typically come a little bit faster. They're not quite as complex as looking at a multilateral agreement where you have a group of countries negotiating. And I do believe that, President Trump and his administration firmly believes that if we do bilateral, that the U.S. is in a little bit stronger negotiating position. And talks with Europeans have been relatively slow compared to other countries. And now recognizing also the European Union is 27 countries, and they have their own internal politics that they have to deal with. So I suspect that negotiations and any kind of agreement with the European Union is still a long ways off. The U.S. is negotiating with a long list of countries right now, trying to get either refinements to existing trade agreements or developing some new trade agreements. And so a lot of things going on behind the scenes. Very little information has been released to the public, which is probably an okay thing because, again, it's negotiations and there's a lot of rumors and things can change very rapidly. So there's still, even though we don't see it in the press, even though we don't see it on the headline news anymore, there's still a lot of uncertainty. There's upside potential, but also significant downside risk in all of that. So just, I guess, things to be aware of, things to be watching. This European Union issue is a little bit of a new wrinkle, and we'll see what happens from here.
On the international trade side, do hear discussion from Brazil or from I guess from that part of the world with regard to their intent to increase the volume of usage. Probably, I'm not sure if it's for corn only or corn and soybeans. Probably for corn, for biofuel production. So and if that happens, well, that would, I don't know if it'd crowd out, but it would crowd a little bit their exportable surplus. So you have these other interactions that could affect the U.S. and we've talked in previous issues here with regard to the strength of U.S. soybean oil exports, and we follow that on a weekly basis, and what had been pretty much almost a sleepy market of 1 or 2 thousand metric tons maybe a week. Well, now you're disappointed if you only have 20,600 metric tons actually shipped, and we've had weeks of 40 and 50 and 60, and so for what had been kind of a weak sector is a strong sector. And my understanding is that soybean oil is going out of the U.S. because of bioenergy related policy moves and of certain Asian countries. So yeah, what's happening in both nationally and internationally in the bioenergy sector certainly affecting the U.S. grain sector at a minimum. So
Yep, absolutely.
And I would say too,
any other comments you guys would have on this?
yeah, I have one related to the trade issue, especially with the EU. A lot of the initial market growth starting very small for SAF was the EU, right? And so trade dispute doesn't necessarily make that, move it in a positive direction. Of course, we'll see how this all plays out. But also too, the EU does not like using food crops or food ingredients for biofuels. And so again, we're seeing all of these shifts in interest, shifts in relationships, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, in coming weeks, the next few years, and in the long term.
Brandon, any final comments?
No, just other than to add one more little wrinkle here, you brought up in particular, for example, corn ethanol production in Brazil. There's also some other biofuels, renewable fuels policies that are taking place in Brazil. I also know that even in the more of the traditional agricultural front, that a lot of the countries that are operating in Brazil that are looking at exports are talking to some of our customers right now, and saying, look, if you get frustrated with the folks that are in the U.S., or if you're looking for a more reliable supply, they're making that pitch right now. And so we can't ignore the fact that our competitors and the companies that are operating in these other countries are definitely talking to our core customer base from the U.S. and asking a lot of questions and offering up some alternatives. So again, both short term as long term, we have to be very careful about how this plays out, and in particularly how the U.S. Responds to some of these issues. So
The poster
just
child
just a
situation.
lot of unknowns, just a lot of unknowns.
Poster child historic situation for that, I think, is that when the Carter administration put an embargo on Russia, that we would not sell them our wheat. Well, Russia then had every incentive to figure out ways to not rely on an unreliable partner. And now
Yeah,
Russia is the number one world wheat exporter in
yeah.
and our
And
primary
and
competition.
a similar thing happened during the Nixon administration when they put an embargo on U.S. soybeans going into Japan. And then the Japanese companies started investing pretty heavily into production in Brazil. And of
There you
course,
go.
as they say, the rest is history. So
Yeah.
there can be long-term implications for some of the changes going on right now. Again, we just need to be aware of what's happening and try and plan accordingly.
Well, with that, thank you, gentlemen. This has been David Riplinger and Frayne Olson of North Dakota State University and Dan O'Brien of the Kansas State University talking about bioenergy issues. Again, this was recorded on Friday, May the 23rd, 2025, and our plans are to come out with this information about once a month. So we'll see you next month then. Thank you very much.